The morning air in St. Mary Mead carried the faint scent of lavender and wet soil after a night's soft rain. The hedgerows glistened, and sparrows darted between the eaves of the thatched cottages. It was, in all appearances, a day like any other, until the bell at the vicarage rang with such insistence that even the postman paused in his rounds. At the heart of the commotion was a single envelope, cream-coloured, thick, and sealed with a faded red wax bearing the Thornton crest, a falcon with wings spread wide. The letter had been discovered not at Thornton House, where Lady Thornton resided, but rather at the doorstep of the vicarage, propped carefully against a flower pot, as though placed by a trembling hand. By noon, word had reached every teapot and knitting circle in the village. Lady Thornton, 82 years old, widowed these 15 years, and known for her sharp tongue and sharper pearls, had been found dead in her writing-room, heart failure, they said, though the circumstances had a chill to them. The curtains were drawn tight despite the morning sun, the ink in her pen still wet, and her final letter, missing. Miss Marple, who had known Lady Thornton since the days when both were younger and the world a little more polite, took her tea in quiet contemplation as the gossip swirled. "A last letter," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley at the grocer's. To whom could she possibly have written? Her solicitor, her nephew in London, or perhaps someone closer? By evening the police had arrived from Much Benham. Inspector Graves, a tall, weary man who had learned long ago to distrust small villages with too much charm. He found Lady Thornton's desk meticulously ordered, her pen resting across a half-written note addressed simply, "My dearest." The inspector frowned. "My dearest who?" But Miss Marple, who had been standing quietly in the doorway after bringing flowers from her garden, noticed what no one else had, the faint imprint of a ring pressed into the blotting paper beside the unfinished note. A man's signet ring, square and heavy, the sort worn by someone who fancied himself of old breeding. She said nothing, only adjusted her shawl and asked softly, "Did anyone see who brought the letter to the vicarage?" No one had. That night, as the lamplight flickered across her sitting room, Miss Marple gazed out at the village green where the world carried on as though nothing had happened. Yet she knew better, for in her long life she had learned that death, in the English countryside, never came without reason, only without haste, and somewhere between the ink of that missing letter and the shadow of a man's ring lay a truth waiting ever so patiently to be seen. The next morning dawned with a pale mist curling over the hedgerows and a hush that seemed to settle heavier than usual upon St. Mary Mead. At precisely 8:30, Miss Marple stepped out of her cottage, shawl wrapped tightly about her narrow shoulders, and made her way toward the vicarage. Her soft-soled shoes made almost no sound upon the damp lane, yet her mind was a quiet storm of recollection. The letter, the ring imprint, the unfinished salutation. She had known Lady Thornton well enough to recognize that the old woman rarely left anything incomplete unless something, or someone, had interrupted her. Reverend Leonard Clement met her at the gate, his expression caught between bewilderment and unease. "Ah, Miss Marple, I rather thought you might call. The police have taken the letter away, of course, but they say it wasn't posted. Just placed." He adjusted his spectacles. "Do you think it could be one of her servants, perhaps? There was that footman years ago. Ran off to London, I believe." "People rarely run off without a reason," Miss Marple murmured. "And they rarely come back without one either." She smiled faintly, her eyes distant. "Did anyone see anyone lingering about the garden yesterday morning?" The vicar hesitated. Only Mrs. Bantry mentioned a stranger, a man in a dark coat standing by the gate near Thornton House just after dawn. She thought he was a tradesman. Miss Marple nodded. Mrs. Bantry always did see more than she admitted to. By mid-morning, Inspector Graves had returned to Thornton House, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming manner, found herself once again invited, or perhaps tolerated, within the quiet grandeur of its halls. The drawing-room smelled faintly of lilies and something more sterile, like freshly polished wood concealing an older rot. The inspector was examining the writing desk. "Curious thing," he said, glancing up at her. "No signs of forced entry. The servants were asleep in their quarters. And yet someone brought a letter to the vicarage at roughly the same hour Lady Thornton was found dead. You wouldn't think the two could be connected." "I should think," Miss Marple replied, "that letters from the dead often have a way of connecting themselves, Inspector." He gave her a wry smile, but she was already leaning closer to the writing desk, her gaze fixed upon the inkwell. "Do you see this small indentation?" she asked quietly, as though someone had leaned upon the desk here, heavily, not the way a lady writes, but the way a man might, standing impatiently over her. The inspector followed her gaze and frowned. "You think someone was with her?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Her eyes traced the faint line of ash upon the carpet near the chair. "Cigarette ash," she said softly. "Lady Thornton never smoked, but her nephew, Mr. Hugh Thornton, was rarely seen without one." The inspector made a note, though his tone remained skeptical. "Hugh Thornton, the heir, arrived from London the evening before her death. Claims he was staying at the inn, but no one remembers seeing him after supper." "Then he was here," Miss Marple said simply, straightening up, "and whatever passed between them was not pleasant." Later that afternoon, the quiet rhythm of the village resumed its strange imitation of normality. Yet behind every lace curtain and teacup conversation, the same questions fluttered like trapped moths. Why had Lady Thornton written one final letter, and what had become of it before it reached its intended hand? Miss Marple took her tea at the Blue Boar with Mrs. Bantry and Mrs. Price Ridley, who were eager to supply their theories. "I'll tell you what I think," Mrs. Bantry declared, stirring her sugar with unnecessary vigor. "That letter was meant for the young gardener, Tom Larkin. Everyone knows she took quite a liking to him, left him little gifts, she did." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "Rubbish. A woman of her breeding writing to a common labourer? It's far more likely she discovered some scandal about that nephew of hers. There were rumours of debts, cards, horses, and worse." Miss Marple, who had been gazing thoughtfully out the window, spoke only once. "People are rarely killed over money alone, my dear Mrs. Price Ridley. Money is simply the language through which resentment is spoken." When she returned home, the evening light lay thin and gold across her front room. She set her teacup down, then took from her basket a small square of blotting paper she had discreetly retrieved earlier from Lady Thornton's desk, an old trick she remembered from her days assisting her nephew Raymond with his manuscripts. The paper held faint impressions of ink that had bled through from the missing page. Under the lamplight, she tilted it gently. A few letters emerged, ghost-like and trembling. "Cannot forgive. Not after what you did to her." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Her. Not me." That small difference of pronoun shifted everything. Lady Thornton had not written a farewell. She had written a condemnation. And whoever received that letter, whoever you was, had reason enough to ensure it never arrived. At dusk, the sound of carriage wheels startled her from thought. Through her window, she saw Hugh Thornton descending from a hired cab, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. He looked not like a man in mourning, but one cornered by something unseen. She watched as he paused at the gate, hesitating as though sensing unseen eyes upon him. Then he turned and strode away toward the inn, his hand tightening briefly around something in his pocket. A folded paper, she thought, though she could not be certain. Miss Marple sat very still. The faint sound of the church clock marked the hour, and in the fading light she whispered, half to herself, "The letter has returned home." Outside, the mist thickened again across the village green, curling around lamp-posts and hedges, concealing faces and intentions alike. But Miss Marple, eyes bright with quiet certainty, knew that soon the mist would lift, and, when it did, every secret in St. Mary Mead would stand, bare and trembling, in the morning light. The following morning, St. Mary Mead woke under a pale sun that seemed reluctant to warm the day. Mist still clung to the hedgerows, drifting through the village lanes like the remnants of a forgotten dream. Miss Marple, already seated at her breakfast table, stirred her tea with delicate precision while her mind moved elsewhere. Toward the letter, the blotting paper, and the expression on Hugh Thornton's face as he arrived the night before. She had seen that look before, a man not yet grieving but anticipating something worse than grief. At 9:30, Inspector Graves appeared at her door, hat in hand, expression drawn. "I thought I might impose on your wisdom, Miss Marple," he began, his tone betraying the faintest unease. "You were quite right about the nephew. He was at Thornton House that evening after all. The maid, Lucy, swore she heard raised voices shortly before 10, yet he insists he left before 11, while Lady Thornton was still alive." Miss Marple invited him in, setting out a modest tray of tea and scones, as though this were merely a visit between friends. "Men often believe that time bends kindly to their version of events, Inspector, but clocks, I find, have rather less sympathy." She handed him a cup, her eyes resting gently upon his. "What does he claim brought him back?" Graves took a sip, grimacing slightly at the strong tea. "He says he came for a reconciliation. Some family quarrel over the estate, though he avoids details. Claims he left after she refused to see reason." "Refused to see reason," Miss Marple repeated, the phrase rolling softly off her tongue. A curious way to describe a dying woman's last conversation. She paused. "Did he mention the letter?" The inspector hesitated. "He did not, but the post-mistress, Mrs. Finch, told us Lady Thornton had inquired last week about express delivery. Said she had a document that must reach someone by morning. We found no such correspondence in her desk." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the window, where the faint shape of the church spire rose above the mist. "Then we may suppose," she said slowly, "that someone ensured it did not." Graves frowned. "You think he took it?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle yet unyielding, "that we mustn't assume the nephew's guilt simply because he looks capable of it. Villages like ours have a way of producing kindness that hides malice, and malice that hides behind kindness." By midday, Miss Marple was seen walking toward Thornton House, basket in hand, as though bringing condolences in the form of lavender and biscuits. Inside, the air remained heavy, faintly perfumed but stale. She was greeted by Lucy, the maid, a nervous girl of 19 with a complexion too pale for her years. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered, wringing her hands. "It's dreadful. It really is. The house feels wrong without her. She was stern, but she always said thank you." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "You were with her that evening, weren't you, my dear?" Lucy nodded. "She'd sent everyone to bed early. Said she wanted quiet. But later," she swallowed hard, "I heard voices. Hers and a man's. I couldn't make out words, only the sound. Then, just after, I thought I heard the piano. Just one note, like someone pressed it by accident." Miss Marple tilted her head. "The piano in the drawing room?" "Yes, ma'am." "Strange," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. "Lady Thornton had arthritis in both hands. She hadn't played in years." Lucy's eyes widened. "Oh, I hadn't thought of that." "Few people do," Miss Marple said softly, touching the girl's arm. "You've been most helpful. Tell me, did anyone visit the next morning before the police arrived?" The girl hesitated, then lowered her voice. "The gardener, Tom Larkin. He came early, said he'd forgotten his tools in the shed. But when I looked later, they weren't there at all." Miss Marple thanked her and left soon after, her thoughts turning over like cards in an invisible hand. By the time she reached the lane, she saw Tom himself leaning against the gate, his cap pulled low, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, "Good morning," she called cheerfully. He started, then tipped his cap awkwardly. "Morning, Miss Marple." "Terrible business, isn't it?" she said, drawing nearer. "Lady Thornton gone so suddenly. You must have been quite fond of her." He looked away. "Aye. She was decent to me. Paid fair, never treated me low. Can't say that about all in this village." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet I hear you were at the house early yesterday. That's rather dutiful of you." Tom's jaw tightened. "I'd left my tools, that's all. Didn't want them pinched." She regarded him a moment longer, then smiled in that mild, disarming way that had unraveled many secrets before. "Quite right. Still, funny thing about tools. When they're missing, they often end up where they were never meant to be." Tom shifted uneasily. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Oh, nothing at all," she said pleasantly. "Only that the police will likely ask you the same thing before long. And it's always best, dear boy, to have one's answers tidied before they do." She left him standing by the gate, the mist now rising around him like smoke. That evening, the inspector returned to Miss Marple's cottage. "We found something," he announced, setting a small evidence envelope on her table. Inside was a fragment of paper, torn roughly from a letter, the ink smudged but legible enough to read 2 words: "To forgive." It had been discovered behind the writing desk, wedged in the floorboard crack. Miss Marple studied it in silence. "Not cannot, forgive," she said softly. "Simply to forgive. The rest was torn away. Perhaps it was never a condemnation, but an appeal." She looked up at Graves. "Inspector, you must speak to Mr. Hugh Thornton again. This time about his mother, not his aunt." Graves frowned. "His mother? She's been dead 20 years. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, her voice faint but certain. "But not in his heart. Lady Thornton blamed him for that death, and he never forgave her for saying so. I believe she wrote that letter to end the quarrel, to forgive him at last. Only someone made sure he'd never read it." The inspector leaned forward. "You think someone else killed her?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the darkened window, where faint lamplight shimmered through the fog. "Someone who needed the hatred between them to remain," she murmured. "Because peace would have meant the loss of everything they hoped to gain." The clock struck 9, its chime echoing softly through the room. Miss Marple poured another cup of tea, eyes gleaming in the dim light. "The truth, Inspector," she said, "is often polite enough to wait until we're ready to notice it." Outside, the mist thickened once more, quiet, patient, and watchful. The following day brought with it a soft drizzle, the kind that blurred the hedges and turned the lane to a ribbon of pale grey. Miss Marple sat by the hearth, knitting in her lap and mind elsewhere, tracing the threads of the case with the same patient precision as her needles. The torn phrase, "to forgive," had unsettled her. Forgiveness was a word that often arrived too late, and when it did, it carried the faint scent of tragedy. When Inspector Graves returned that afternoon, his boots leaving damp prints on her carpet, she had already prepared tea. "You were quite right," he said without preamble. "Hugh Thornton was confronted with something that night. He admitted as much. Says his aunt accused him of his mother's death. Some nonsense about neglect, about gambling when he should have been at her bedside. He swears he left the house before she died, though he can't prove it." Miss Marple regarded him quietly. "And you believe him?" Graves exhaled. "He's a fool, not a killer, but there's something odd. Tom Larkin vanished this morning, packed his things from the gardener's shed and gone. No one saw him leave." Miss Marple's hands paused on her knitting. "Vanished," she repeated softly. "People who vanish do so for one of 2 reasons, Inspector. Fear or guilt. Sometimes both." She rose, her joints stiff but her step steady, and fetched her coat. "We shall take a walk to Thornton House, if you please. There's something that needs looking at in the drawing room." The rain had lightened into mist again by the time they arrived. The house stood still beneath the grey sky, its windows dark, its air heavy with something unspoken. Inside, Miss Marple went straight to the piano. She lifted the cover from the keys, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then softly, she pressed a single note. It rang clear, though faintly muted. She lifted the lid and peered inside. "There," she said quietly. Graves leaned closer. Wedged beneath the strings was a small metal key, tarnished and dull. "What's this?" he asked. "Not a house key?" Miss Marple murmured. "Too small, a drawer key perhaps, or a box." Graves fetched it out with his penknife, and the two of them turned toward Lady Thornton's writing desk. In one of the smaller drawers, long locked, the key fit perfectly. Inside was a narrow tin box lined with faded velvet, containing letters bound neatly with a black ribbon. Miss Marple untied it slowly, her eyes scanning the topmost sheet. "They're all addressed to Hugh," she said. "Written over the past year, unsent. Each one begins with the same phrase, 'My dearest boy.'" She paused, reading further. She wanted to forgive him long before that night. Graves frowned. Then why didn't she? Miss Marple's gaze fell to the handwriting, firm in earlier letters, trembling in the last. Because someone wanted her silence to last a little longer, long enough for them to act. She turned one of the envelopes over. The seal was broken, as if by rough hands. "Inspector, someone has read these before us." Graves scowled. "Larkin." Miss Marple nodded faintly. "He had access to the study, and he would have known where Lady Thornton kept her keys, but not, I think, for greed." Her voice softened. "There's something pitiable in the way fear drives certain men to loyalty they cannot afford." They left the house in silence. The village, wrapped in fog, seemed to listen. When they reached the inn, the innkeeper hurried out, wiping his hands on his apron. "You'll be after the young gardener, I suppose." "Left at dawn. Caught the bus to Much Benham, but I'd wager he won't have gone far. He left a parcel behind." The inspector took the parcel, unwrapped the brown paper, and revealed a woman's locket, old and dented. Inside was a faded photograph of Lady Thornton in her youth, and beside her a young man who was certainly not her husband. Miss Marple studied it closely. "So that's the secret she kept all these years?" Graves looked puzzled. "Who's the man?" "Tom Larkin's grandfather," Miss Marple said softly. "I recall him. Charles Larkin, Lady Thornton's coachman before her marriage. It seems affection ran deep once, and perhaps regret deeper still." Understanding dawned slowly across the inspector's face. "You think Lady Thornton meant to leave something to the boy? The letter was for him." Miss Marple nodded. "It would explain his disappearance. He thought the police would find the locket and accuse him of theft, or worse. Yet the real danger lies elsewhere." That evening, Miss Marple returned home and lit her lamp, watching the rain streak against the glass. She could not sleep. The pattern was almost complete, but one thread remained loose. The letter left at the vicarage. Why there? Why not delivered directly to its recipient? Unless, she thought, the vicarage had been chosen for safety, for secrecy. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. When she opened it, she found Lucy, pale and trembling under a shawl. "I had to tell you," the girl whispered. "I saw Mr. Hugh last night. He came back to the house again, said he needed something from his aunt's things. I didn't let him in, but he waited by the window for nearly half an hour." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what did he take, my dear?" Lucy hesitated. "A letter, from the drawer by the writing desk. I saw him through the glass." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, the final piece falling into place. "Thank you, child. You've done a brave thing." When the girl left, Miss Marple sat alone in the dim light. Outside, the church bell tolled 9, its echo carrying through the mist. Somewhere, she knew, Hugh Thornton now held the letter that might have saved him had he read it sooner. But guilt, like forgiveness, often arrived too late to change anything. She leaned back in her chair, her voice barely more than a whisper. "The living always fear the truth of the dead," she said to the quiet room. "But the dead, they fear nothing at all." And as the lamplight flickered low, the rain continued to fall, soft, persistent, and knowing over a village where secrets never stayed buried for long. The next morning brought a curious calm over St. Mary Mead. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a hush that seemed almost deliberate, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple awoke early, the memory of Lucy's confession still circling in her thoughts. Hugh Thornton had returned to the house under cover of darkness. He had taken the letter, but the question that mattered most, the question that hummed like a thread beneath everything, was why now? At 9, Inspector Graves arrived once more, looking more tired than usual. "We've found him," he said, his voice flat. "Tom Larkin, or rather, what's left of his things. They found his coat by the riverbank at Much Benham, but no sign of the man himself. The bus driver swears he got off at the last stop before the bridge." Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. "The river runs deep there," she said, "and the currents are quick after rain. You think he's drowned?" Graves hesitated. "It looks that way, but I don't believe it. Something about it feels arranged." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So do most drownings that happen conveniently, Inspector. People who are guilty often run, but people who are frightened are made to disappear." They went together to the inn, where the morning papers still lay, unopened on the counter. The landlord, Mr. Jacobs, shuffled nervously when Miss Marple approached. "Terrible business," he muttered. "That young lad seemed in such a hurry yesterday. Bought a ticket with shaking hands. I thought he'd done something foolish. Then last night, well, there was shouting near the stables. I looked out but saw only a carriage driving away. Couldn't make out who it was, though it was heading toward the Thorntons' lane." Graves' eyes darkened. "Another carriage? That makes 3 visits in as many nights." Miss Marple said nothing, but her fingers tightened slightly on her shawl. She knew patterns, and this one was closing. By noon, the inspector had gone to summon Hugh Thornton from the inn, but when he returned to report, his expression was grim. "He's gone too, left before dawn. The innkeeper says he received a telegram late last night. Claimed it was from his solicitor, but there's no record of one being sent." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "Then he didn't receive a telegram," she said softly. "He was lured away. Someone wanted him gone before the truth caught up." The two of them returned to Thornton House once more. The corridors seemed colder now, the scent of old polish mingling with something faintly metallic. In the writing room, the piano still stood open, the note she had struck the day before, faintly echoing in her memory. Miss Marple moved to the desk again, eyes narrowing. "Inspector, do you notice something peculiar?" He frowned. "Only that everything looks tidier than it did yesterday." "Precisely," she said. "A dead woman's desk does not tidy itself." They examined the drawers. The tin box was gone, the letters with it. Whoever had returned in the night had known exactly what to take. Miss Marple turned toward the window, where the faint outline of boot marks lingered in the damp earth below. Larger than a woman's, smaller than the inspector's, size 9, she thought absently. The kind worn by a man accustomed to walking the estate grounds. "Hughes?" Graves asked quietly. "Perhaps, but not necessarily. They could belong to the man who delivered the false telegram." She looked up at him, her eyes bright. "Inspector, we must find where those letters were meant to go. Lady Thornton wrote not one, but many, and she trusted the vicarage to keep safe what her own home could not." They left at once for Reverend Clement's study. The vicar, startled but obliging, fetched the parish post-bag. After some rummaging, he produced an envelope sealed in the same red wax as the one found days before. "Odd thing," he said. "This was slipped under my door the night after her death. I meant to hand it to the inspector, but, well, things became rather muddled." Graves took the letter carefully, examining the broken seal. Inside was a single sheet, the handwriting unmistakably Lady Thornton's. It read, "To be delivered only upon my death. To my nephew, Hugh Thornton. I've done you great wrong. The truth of your mother's death is not what I believed. I was deceived by someone I trusted. If you read this, know that I have forgiven you and that I fear for you now." Graves exhaled sharply. So she knew. Miss Marple's eyes did not leave the page. Yes, and the one who deceived her could not allow this letter to surface. The motive was not greed, but preservation. Someone feared what forgiveness would expose. That evening, Miss Marple sat again by her fire, her knitting untouched. She could hear the rain starting up once more, tapping at the windows like fingers seeking entry. The faces of those involved passed before her mind in quiet procession. The bitter nephew, the frightened maid, the vanished gardener. Yet one face lingered longer than the rest, calm, pious, and often overlooked. She rose abruptly, shawl around her shoulders, and stepped into the storm. The vicarage lights were still burning when she arrived. Reverend Clement answered the door, surprised to see her drenched and pale. "Miss Marple, my dear lady, what on earth?" She stepped inside, her eyes calm but unyielding. "I believe," she said softly, "that Lady Thornton trusted you with her letters, not only because you were the vicar, but because you once promised her confidentiality, and you delivered on that promise. Just not to her." His face stiffened, color draining. "I don't know what you mean." But Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost sorrowful. "You were her late husband's confessor, were you not? You knew the truth of that old scandal, the affair, the child, the secret that could have destroyed her name. You convinced her that her own son was to blame for his mother's death when you knew otherwise. And when she discovered your deceit, she wrote to expose you. That is why the letter never reached Hugh." For a long moment the only sound was the rain. Then the vicar sank into a chair, his composure crumbling like old parchment. "She would have ruined everything," he whispered. "Her husband's memory, the parish, my own life. I only wanted peace." "Peace," Miss Marple said quietly, "is never bought with lies, Reverend. It merely waits its turn to speak." Outside, the thunder rolled over the village, and the lamps flickered in the distance. Somewhere down by the river, the current carried something unseen away into the dark, but in Miss Marple's mind, the current of truth had already reached the shore. Reverend Clement sat hunched forward, the firelight catching the tremor in his hands. The air in the vicarage seemed to thicken with the weight of what had been spoken. Miss Marple stood quietly across from him, her expression not one of triumph, but of quiet sorrow. "You see, Reverend," she said softly, "truth is much like the rain. It finds its way through every crack, no matter how carefully one seals the roof." He pressed a hand to his temple, voice low. "I never meant for harm to come to her. I thought if the matter stayed buried, no one need suffer. Her husband's name would remain untarnished, the parish spared scandal. Lady Thornton was an old woman, lonely, sharp-tongued, yes, but proud. When she discovered what I'd done, she sent for me. I went to her that night to beg forgiveness." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "You were there?" "Yes." He looked up, eyes red-rimmed. "But when I arrived, Hugh was already in the study, furious. She accused him of his mother's death once more. He stormed out, and I—" His voice faltered. "I found her collapsed at her desk not 10 minutes later. The letter lay before her, half-written. I thought it would destroy everything she'd built, so I took it." Miss Marple drew a long breath. "And replaced it with the blank page the police found." He nodded weakly. "I told myself it was mercy, but then she was gone, and the lie remained." For a moment, only the ticking of the clock filled the room. Then Miss Marple spoke, her tone quiet but firm. "Mercy, Reverend, is never found through deceit. You may have silenced a scandal, but you condemned a family to despair. Hugh believed his aunt's hatred followed him to her death. And poor Tom Larkin, he became the scapegoat of a sin not his own." Clement bowed his head. "I thought the boy's disappearance would end it. I prayed he'd gone to London, away from this wretched place. I didn't know he'd—" He broke off, shaking. "Do you truly think he's dead?" Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "No," she said after a pause. "I think Tom Larkin is very much alive, and he has something you no longer possess, Reverend, a conscience that cannot rest until the truth is told." At that, a faint sound stirred outside the vicarage, a hesitant knock at the back door. Both turned sharply. Graves, who had been standing silent near the mantel, crossed the room and opened it. The wind swept in, carrying with it a thin figure, drenched and trembling. It was Tom. His face was pale beneath streaks of rain, his eyes wide with exhaustion. "I didn't mean to run," he stammered. "I thought they'd think it was me. But when I saw the paper this morning, when they said Mr. Hugh was gone too, I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Miss Marple approached him gently. "You did the right thing coming back, my dear. Sit down now and tell us what truly happened that night." Tom sank into the chair near the hearth, his wet coat dripping onto the floor. "She called me in after supper," he began, voice quavering. "Said she wanted to thank me for tending the roses. Gave me a small box. Told me it was a keepsake, something that belonged to my grandfather. I didn't open it till later. It was the locket you found. But when I came back the next morning to thank her, she was gone. Dead. I saw the Reverend, leaving the house. He looked wrong, pale, like he'd seen a ghost." The Reverend's shoulders stiffened. "You followed me?" Tom nodded. "You dropped something, a letter. I picked it up. I still have it." From his coat pocket, he drew a folded, water-stained paper and handed it to Miss Marple. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it. The ink had run, but the words were still legible enough. "To forgive is to set oneself free from the past. I have lived too long in bitterness. If I do not wake tomorrow, may my soul find peace in the truth I once feared to face." Miss Marple read it aloud, her voice steady. When she finished, she looked at the Reverend. "It seems in the end, she forgave you too. You could have spared us all this, had you trusted her mercy." The vicar's head sank into his hands. "I cannot undo it now." "No," she said quietly, "but you can stop it from taking another life. Hugh Thornton has gone because he believes himself cursed by her memory. You must help us find him." They set out at once, the storm thickening as they moved through the narrow lanes toward the railway road. Miss Marple walked slowly, eyes trained on the ground, her lamp cutting thin paths through the mist. At the bend near the mill, she stopped. "There," she murmured. Footprints, fresh, half-washed by rain, leading toward the old stone bridge. Graves called out into the dark, "Thornton! Hugh Thornton!" A faint answer came, broken by the wind. They followed the sound and found Hugh standing by the railing, soaked and trembling. His coat was torn, his face hollow. He looked at them as if they were ghosts. "I didn't kill her," he said hoarsely. "I swear I didn't, but everywhere I go I see her, writing that damned letter." Miss Marple stepped forward, her tone firm yet kind. "She forgave you, Hugh. She never meant for you to carry her burden. It was not hatred that kept her silent. It was fear, and that fear is over now." He stared at her, disbelieving. "Forgave me?" She held out the letter. "These are her words. Read them." He took the paper with shaking hands, eyes scanning the lines. The rain fell harder, smudging the ink further, but he didn't seem to notice. When at last he looked up, something inside him had changed, a deep, weary peace replacing the torment. "She forgave me," he whispered again, this time not as a question. Miss Marple placed a hand on his arm. "Yes, my dear, and it's time you forgave yourself." Behind them the vicar stood motionless, the truth hanging between them like tolling bells. Graves said nothing. He only glanced toward Miss Marple, who gave the smallest nod. The storm had done its work. It had washed away every pretense, leaving only what could no longer be denied. As they turned back toward the village, Miss Marple paused once more to look at the river. The mist had begun to lift, revealing its dark, restless current. "Strange thing, Inspector," she murmured. "Guilt drowns more quietly than sin, but it always leaves a ripple behind." The following days passed in a strange quiet. The rain had finally stopped, and the air over St. Mary Mead felt lighter, though not freer. Beneath the calm, something unspoken lingered, like a shadow that refused to lift, even after confession. Miss Marple had seen such silences before. They were not peace, but exhaustion masquerading as it. She knew the village was watching, waiting for her to declare the matter closed. But in her mind there remained one unanswered thread. Hugh Thornton had been cleared of suspicion, and Reverend Clement's guilt, if not criminal, then moral, was plain enough. And yet Miss Marple could not forget one small, stubborn detail, the missing tin box. The letters were gone. They had vanished before the Reverend's admission, before Tom's return. Whoever had taken them had known precisely what they were doing. On the third morning, Inspector Graves came to see her once more. His manner was weary, his hat damp from mist. "I've spoken to the coroner," he said. "Lady Thornton's death was natural. Heart failure, just as we thought. No poison, no violence. But I can't shake the feeling we've missed something." Miss Marple looked up from her embroidery. "We have, Inspector. Not something, but someone." He frowned. "Someone?" The vicar confessed. "Hugh's cleared. Tom's told us his side. Who else is there?" Miss Marple gave him a small, knowing smile. "The one who profited from silence, of course. Lady Thornton's housekeeper, Mrs. Drayton. You've noticed how very little we've heard from her." Graves blinked. "Drayton? But she's been in service 20 years. Loyal, practical sort. Never left the house since the old days." "Precisely," Miss Marple said softly. "Loyalty is a curious thing, Inspector. It can be bought, bent, or broken, but rarely examined." They went together to Thornton House once more, where Mrs. Drayton received them in the morning room, her starched apron immaculate, her hair drawn back in a tight knot. She had the air of someone who had already prepared her answers. "I can't imagine what more there is to discuss," she said briskly. "The mistress was old, her heart was weak. It's a mercy she went quickly." Miss Marple studied her with mild interest. "Yes, a mercy indeed. Though I was puzzled, my dear Mrs. Drayton, by the tidiness of her writing desk after her passing. You have such an efficient hand. The police tell me it was spotless when they arrived." Mrs. Drayton stiffened slightly. "It was my duty to keep it neat. I couldn't have the inspector thinking we lived in chaos." "Of course," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "But in tidying, you may have moved something quite precious. Some papers, perhaps, a tin box bound in velvet." The housekeeper's eyes flickered, just for a moment, then steadied. "I don't recall any box." Graves stepped forward. "You wouldn't by chance have seen Mr. Hugh that evening, would you?" Her composure wavered. "Only in passing. He came late, I think. I was in the kitchen. He asked for tea, but when I brought it, he was gone." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Gone where?" I couldn't say." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Then perhaps you can tell me why your cousin in Much Benham suddenly came into a sum of £50 this week. Quite the coincidence, don't you think? Especially since the missing letters, had they been found, might have altered the estate entirely. Poor Hugh would have inherited far less if Lady Thornton's forgiveness had been made public." Mrs. Drayton's face drained of colour. "You've no proof of that," she said sharply. "Proof is rarely neat, Mrs. Drayton," Miss Marple replied gently. "But people are. You see, I noticed the lace cuffs you wear. Lovely, but rather impractical for housework. The same lace that caught the edge of wax when you sealed that letter for the vicarage. The same pattern, I might add, impressed faintly into the red seal itself." Graves pulled a small envelope from his pocket, the one found at the vicarage. Under the inspector's magnifying glass, the impression was visible now, a delicate scalloped pattern. Mrs. Drayton's cuffs bore the same. For a long moment, the room was silent but for the ticking clock. Then Mrs. Drayton spoke, her voice low, trembling. "She was going to change her will," she said. "Give everything to that boy, the gardener. Said he was family, said he had a right to it. After all I'd done. 20 years in that house, 20 years cleaning up after her tempers, her cruelty, and she was ready to throw it all away on a stranger." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "So you kept the letters, hid them, believed you could hold the truth at bay." Mrs. Drayton's mouth twisted. "I didn't mean for her to die. I only meant to keep her quiet until I could convince her. But she was gone by morning. Then the letters, well, I thought if no one saw them, it could all stay as it was." "And when the Reverend came to you, frightened after his visit, you told him you'd seen Hugh leaving, didn't you?" Miss Marple's tone was almost kind. "It was you who started that whisper, the one that made the nephew flee." The woman sank into a chair, eyes glazed. "I never wanted anyone hurt. I only wanted what I was owed." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "That's the oldest reason of all." Graves motioned for his constable, who waited in the doorway. Mrs. Drayton did not resist as they led her away. When the house was quiet again, Miss Marple remained standing by the writing desk, her eyes upon the empty chair. "It's strange, Inspector," she said softly. "Lady Thornton spent her life punishing others for imagined sins. And in the end, it was forgiveness, not guilt, that killed her. People so rarely understand that mercy is the sharpest blade of all." Graves nodded solemnly. "You think she knew the housekeeper meant her harm?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No, I think she pitied her. And that, I'm afraid, was far worse." Outside, the mist was finally breaking, the air sweet with the smell of turned earth and thawing spring. The truth had settled, as truths always did, quietly, without spectacle. And as Miss Marple walked back toward her cottage, the bells of St. Mary Mead began to toll for evening service, slow and deliberate, their sound carrying over the village like the echo of a conscience long delayed. The village exhaled after Mrs. Drayton's arrest, though not in relief, rather in a kind of weary bewilderment. The gossips at the grocer's spoke of her in hushed tones, alternating between sympathy and scandal. Some said she had always been too proud for her station. Others whispered that she had loved Lady Thornton once, in her way, and could not bear to see affection turned toward another. Miss Marple, however, took no part in these speculations. She had long ago learned that after the truth is revealed, people rush to fill the silence it leaves behind with noise of their own making. For her part, she spent the next morning quietly in her garden, trimming the lavender. Yet even as she worked, a small unease tugged at her. Something about the ending did not fit. Mrs. Drayton had confessed to hiding the letters. Yes, but her manner had not been entirely false. There had been surprise in her eyes. Real surprise, when Miss Marple mentioned the tin box. And surprise was a rare thing in the truly guilty. By late afternoon, the unease had grown into a certainty that something still moved beneath the surface. She put away her shears, changed into her blue shawl, and set out once more toward Thornton House. The air was still, the only sound the crunch of gravel underfoot and the faint, distant hum of bees. The once grand house stood hollow now, its windows shuttered and cold. She found Inspector Graves there, speaking with the constable. "I thought you'd be at home by the fire, Miss Marple," he said, though without surprise. "I've learned, Inspector," she replied with a faint smile, "that one should never assume a story has ended simply because everyone wishes it had." He raised an eyebrow. "You think there's more?" "I think Mrs. Drayton told the truth, at least the truth she believed, but she didn't have the books. Someone else did, and I dare say they've been rather clever about it." They entered the drawing room once again. The desk stood as before, its drawers empty, its purpose spent. Yet Miss Marple's eyes were not on the desk. They were on the floorboards just beside it, where a faint outline of disturbed dust caught the afternoon light. She knelt carefully and pressed her hand against the wood. "Ah," she murmured. "I thought as much. There's a hollow space here." Graves fetched a small screwdriver from the constable's case, and together they pried up the panel. Beneath it lay the tin box, its surface dulled by time but otherwise untouched. Miss Marple lifted it with both hands, as though cradling a memory, and placed it on the table. When they opened it, they found not only the letters, but something else, a folded will, dated just 2 days before Lady Thornton's death. Graves scanned the first page and whistled softly. "Well, I'll be damned. This leaves the estate not to Hugh or to any servant, but to the Church Restoration Fund." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes grew distant. "Then we have been looking in the wrong direction entirely. Mrs. Drayton hid what she feared, but someone else took what they desired." Graves frowned. "The vicar?" She nodded slowly. "He said he went to beg forgiveness, and perhaps he did. But men in despair sometimes make bargains with themselves. He might have told himself that preserving her husband's memory justified anything. A forged will, one that restored funds to the parish rather than to family, would seem a noble deceit. Until she discovered it." Graves stared at the papers. "But how could she have known?" "Because," Miss Marple said quietly, "she was sharper than he believed. She asked him to bring the will for her to sign, and when he returned with the forgery, she compared it to her original draft. That was the argument Lucy heard, the raised voices, the accusation. She threatened to expose him, and in the struggle of emotion, her heart failed. He didn't kill her, but he let the lie remain. That, I fear, is what haunts him still." There was silence between them, filled only by the faint rustle of the curtains. Then Graves straightened. "We'll have to question him again." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "He will confess, Inspector. Not because you demand it, but because the burden of unspoken guilt is far heavier than any punishment you might impose." That evening, her words proved true. A messenger came before midnight, breathless and pale. Reverend Clement had been found in his study, collapsed before the altar with a half-written letter addressed to the bishop. The will and the letters lay beside him. His heart had failed him as Lady Thornton's had. Two souls bound by silence, undone by the same frailty of conscience. When Miss Marple arrived, the vicarage was still lit, though dimly. She moved quietly among the gathered villagers, her expression solemn, not surprised. She paused at his desk, reading the unfinished note. "The truth must be known. I can no longer bear the mercy I never earned." She folded it carefully, handing it to the inspector. "In the end," she said softly, "he kept his final promise to her." Graves sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. And to think, all this over, a handful of letters. Miss Marple looked out the window toward the churchyard, where the dawn was just beginning to lighten the stones. "Letters are never just words, Inspector. They are what people dare not say aloud, and when they're left unread, they become heavier than any secret." Outside, the first birds began to sing. St. Mary Mead would wake to the news soon enough. One more sorrow, neatly folded into the rhythm of village life. There would be whispers at the grocer's, tea poured over trembling hands, and soon talk would turn to something else. Yet Miss Marple knew the quiet would linger for a while, like the echo of an old bell. As she stepped into the pale morning light, she thought of Lady Thornton's last letter, the one that had begun with "My dearest boy." In a world so small, forgiveness had travelled so far and arrived too late. And yet, somehow, Miss Marple felt that peace had finally come, not to those who had sought it, but to the truth itself. The funeral of Reverend Clement took place 2 days later, beneath a sky the colour of pewter. The villagers gathered in small, solemn clusters along the churchyard path, their whispers fading as the bell tolled once, twice, then fell silent. Miss Marple stood near the yew tree, her gloved hands clasped before her, her face expressionless save for the faintest hint of sorrow. She had seen too many endings in her lifetime to mistake this one for peace. There was no peace in it, only completion. And yet, as the coffin was lowered into the earth beside Lady Thornton's grave, she felt the faint, inevitable turning of a circle that had been closing for years. Inspector Graves stood beside her, hat in hand. "It's a sad business," he murmured, "though I suppose justice has a way of settling itself, one way or another." "Justice," Miss Marple said softly, "rarely comes when we expect it, Inspector. It prefers to arrive uninvited, like a distant cousin at tea, bearing truths we'd rather not hear." He gave her a weary look, uncertain whether to smile. "Do you really think it's over, then? The housekeeper in custody, the vicar dead, the estate in probate. Seems to me the whole matter's laid to rest." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the church. "One might hope so, but forgiveness and truth seldom die together. There's still the matter of what comes next, what becomes of those left behind, to remember." She did not elaborate, but her eyes had fixed briefly upon Hugh Thornton, who stood alone near the gate, his dark coat soaked through with drizzle. He looked younger now, almost frail, as though the burden of his inheritance, both moral and material, had aged him backwards rather than forward. When the service ended and the crowd began to disperse, Miss Marple approached him quietly. "You mustn't let grief turn into guilt, my dear," she said gently. "It's a habit difficult to break once begun." Hugh looked at her, his eyes tired but steady. "I don't deserve forgiveness, Miss Marple. Not from her, not from anyone. My aunt was right about me. I wasted everything she gave me." "She was wrong," Miss Marple said firmly, "and she knew it before the end. That was the purpose of her letter, to mend what pride had torn apart. You are both victims of silence, not malice." He stared past her, toward the graves. "The villagers won't see it that way. To them, I'll always be the nephew who quarreled with her before she died, the one who ran away." "Villagers remember what suits them," she said, a small smile flickering across her lips, "and forget the rest when it's convenient. In time, they'll find a new story to whisper about. You must live yours differently." He nodded faintly, though his expression carried no conviction. "I'm leaving, Miss Marple. The estate's too heavy a reminder. I'll sell it and go north, somewhere quiet. Perhaps that will be enough." "Perhaps," she murmured, though she doubted he would find quiet in any place where his heart still carried the echo of unspoken things. That evening, as dusk folded over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat once more by her window, watching the lamps flicker to life along the village lane. The events of the past fortnight felt distant now, yet not finished. Closure, she thought, was an illusion people comforted themselves with. The truth never really ended. It simply settled into the corners of memory, waiting to be remembered again. A knock came at her door just as she was pouring her tea. It was Lucy, the maid from Thornton House, her face pale and anxious. "I'm sorry to bother you, Miss Marple, but I didn't know who else to go to," she began. "They've locked the house now. The lawyers said so, but this morning I went to fetch my things and I found something strange." Miss Marple motioned her to sit. "What sort of strange thing, my dear?" Lucy fumbled in her coat pocket and drew out a folded scrap of thick paper, yellowed and brittle. "It was behind the mantel in the mistress's room. I don't know how it got there." Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. Lady Thornton's, but the tone was unlike the letters they had already read. This was not a farewell, nor a confession. It was a statement of intent. To whomsoever finds this, know that I have placed the truth in safe hands. There is one among you who serves righteousness only when it suits ambition. Should harm come to me, the secret will out in time. For sins of the past cannot be buried by those who profit from them. Miss Marple read it twice before looking up. Was this dated? Lucy shook her head. No, ma'am, but the paper, well, it smells of lavender, the kind she used last winter. Miss Marple folded the note and sat back, her brows drawn together in thought. Then this was written before her death, perhaps months before. She feared more than betrayal. She feared discovery. Lucy's eyes widened. But the Reverend, he's gone, and Mrs. Drayton's confessed. Who else could she mean? Miss Marple's voice lowered. That is precisely what troubles me. Later that night, she took a slow walk to the churchyard, lantern in hand. The path glistened with damp leaves, and the wind carried the faint scent of turned earth. She stopped before the fresh grave of Reverend Clement, her light casting long, wavering shadows over the stone. There was something about the burial that nagged at her, the haste of it, the absence of any formal autopsy. Graves had said it was heart failure, and she had not questioned it. But Lady Thornton's letter, its warning now whispered in her mind with unnerving clarity. She turned, the wind rustling through the yew branches like a sigh. Somewhere beyond the trees, a figure moved, a lantern's faint glow swaying in the dark. For a moment, she thought it might be the inspector, but the gait was wrong. Slower, deliberate. "Who's there?" she called softly. The light paused, then vanished. Only the sound of retreating footsteps remained, quick and muffled against the wet ground. Miss Marple stood very still, her heart calm but alert. She knew the pattern of danger when it approached softly, wrapped in civility. There were still lies buried in this village, and the dead, it seemed, were not the only ones determined to keep them hidden. As she turned back toward the road, she whispered to herself, "Secrets have roots, not graves." The mist thickened once more behind her, swallowing the churchyard whole as though the night itself had decided to keep its own counsel. The next morning broke with an uneasy stillness. The mist had not lifted, and the fields beyond St. Mary Mead were veiled in a thin, silvery gloom that seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple had slept little. Her thoughts returned again and again to the anonymous figure in the churchyard and to the lavender-scented note Lucy had brought her. Lady Thornton's warning, its phrasing, its restraint, was not written by a frightened woman, but by one who knew she was surrounded by masks. Someone had moved freely among the living after her death. Someone clever enough to survive the storm her revelations had caused. At 8:30, Inspector Graves called upon her. His manner was unusually grave, and he declined her offer of tea. "Something's happened, Miss Marple," he said. "The sexton found the vicar's grave disturbed early this morning. Not much, just the topsoil turned as if someone had been digging, then stopped." Her hands stilled upon the teapot. "Stopped or interrupted?" Graves hesitated. "That's what puzzles me. The marks suggest haste. Whoever it was left before finishing. And the oddest part, the coffin lid wasn't sealed properly when they buried him. It was shut, yes, but not nailed down." Miss Marple's blue eyes sharpened with quiet alarm. "Then whoever buried him never intended the grave to be his resting place. They wanted access later." The inspector looked uneasy. "You think something was hidden there?" "Or placed there," she replied softly. "When a person fears discovery, they often hide truth in proximity to sanctity, thinking no one will dare disturb it. Lady Thornton's letters, her new will, perhaps they were not the only documents in play." Within the hour, they were at the churchyard, the fog still clinging to the stones like breath on glass. The sexton led them to the grave, his hands trembling slightly. "Didn't like the look of it, sir. Earth too soft, not the kind that settles proper." Graves crouched beside the mound while the constable began to dig carefully. The spade hit something with a dull, hollow thud. He brushed away the dirt, and the metallic glint of a small box emerged. Iron, rusted, and clearly old. Miss Marple knelt beside it, her fingers tracing the worn edge before it was pried open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a packet of letters tied with a faded ribbon and a small velvet pouch. Graves opened the pouch, revealing a string of pearls, dull with age but unmistakably fine. "Her jewels," he muttered. "Lady Thornton's missing heirloom set, the one the solicitor swore was never recovered after her husband's death." Miss Marple read the top letter, its ink blurred but legible enough. Her face remained still as stone. "It's a confession," she said quietly, "written by Reverend Clement himself. He admits to forging the will, but not for greed. He wrote that he feared someone would use the original to blackmail Lady Thornton. He hid her jewels to keep them from the one who claimed to protect her." Graves frowned. That phrase again, "the one who claimed to protect her." It could mean anyone. Miss Marple shook her head. "Not anyone. Someone who presented themselves as a friend of the family. Someone who moved between both worlds, the gentry and the parish, without suspicion." She looked up toward the church, her expression faintly grim. "Inspector, do you recall the man who managed Lady Thornton's accounts after her husband's passing? Mr. Albert Redmayne?" Graves blinked. "Yes, the solicitor's clerk. But he's retired, hasn't he?" "Retired," Miss Marple murmured. "But never far. He's been staying in Much Benham these past months, advising the parish on its restoration fund. He would have known of the new will and had access to every document passing through the vicarage." As if summoned by her words, a shadow appeared in the mist near the church door. A man, thin, stooped slightly, walking with the slow assurance of one who does not believe himself observed. Graves gestured to his constable, but Miss Marple lifted a hand. "No, let him come." Redmayne halted when he saw them, his expression freezing in that brief, fatal flicker of recognition. "Ah, Inspector, Miss Marple, how very early you're about this morning." The inspector's voice was even. "We might say the same of you, Mr. Redmayne. Out for a walk?" He smiled thinly. "An old habit. The air clears the mind." "Or clouds it," Miss Marple said gently, "especially when one walks by graves that do not lie quietly. You've been back several nights now, haven't you? Searching for something you feared Lady Thornton might have left behind." His composure cracked just slightly. "You've no proof of that." "The pearls are proof enough," she said. "You managed her accounts and her inheritance. You embezzled little by little, hiding the losses in church funds. When she discovered the irregularities, she confronted you, but you persuaded the Reverend she had misunderstood. You were clever enough to make your deceit appear as devotion. But when she found the missing statements again, she wrote the letters, the ones that would expose you. You killed no one, Mr. Redmayne, but you fed every lie that led to both their deaths." His lips trembled, the veneer of civility slipping away. "You've no idea what that woman was like. Her threats, her cruelty. She'd have ruined the parish, the Reverend, everything." "She ruined nothing," Miss Marple said quietly. "You did that yourself." He lunged suddenly, as if to snatch the letters from Graves' hand, but the constable caught him easily. In the struggle, one of the letters fell into the mud, the ink bleeding into the soil. Miss Marple stooped and lifted it carefully, her expression mournful. "The truth," she murmured, "is a persistent thing, isn't it? It waits, even in the ground." Later, as Redmayne was led away, the fog began to thin. The sun, pale and hesitant, broke through the clouds, lighting the church spire like a candle. Miss Marple remained at the grave, watching as the constable replaced the earth, firming it down at last. Graves approached quietly. "So that's the end of it," she smiled faintly. "The end, yes, but not the conclusion. There will be talk of greed, deceit, and scandal for weeks, no doubt. But beneath all that, Inspector, there's something far simpler, a warning. The heart, when it seeks righteousness without kindness, always loses its way." He nodded, glancing back toward the village. "And you, Miss Marple, will you be content to let this rest now?" She looked toward the graves once more, the woman, the vicar, and now the truth between them, and gave a small, weary nod. "Yes, I think so. For even in death, some letters finally reach their destination." As they walked back toward the lane, the wind stirred the churchyard trees, scattering pale petals across the fresh soil. They fell like fragments of an unsealed envelope, drifting quietly into the earth, carrying, at last, the message that had taken so long to arrive. The days that followed brought a strange hush over St. Mary Mead, as though the village itself were weary of secrets. The headlines in the local paper carried the story in careful phrases. Financial irregularities linked to church trustee. Reverend's confession brings closure to Thornton affair. Yet for those who had lived through it, there was no real closure, only a lingering unease that refused to fade with the ink. Miss Marple noticed it in the way the postmistress lowered her voice when discussing the vicarage, in the sudden silences that fell when the church bell rang for evening service. Truth, she reflected, was never entirely clean. It left traces like soot, even when justice had done its work. She spent her mornings quietly, tending her garden and writing brief notes of condolence to those left adrift by the scandal. But her mind, ever methodical, could not help returning to the one question that still troubled her. Why had Lady Thornton written that final cryptic warning about the one who claimed to protect her? Redmayne's deceit explained much, but there was a subtlety in her phrasing that suggested something deeper. A protection gone wrong, yes, but perhaps not only financial. There was emotion in it, fear sharpened by betrayal, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that emotion always outlasted money. One foggy afternoon, as she walked past the churchyard, she noticed Hugh Thornton standing alone beside his aunt's grave. His figure seemed thinner than before, his face pale beneath the collar of his coat. She approached quietly, her footsteps muffled by damp earth. "You've come again," she said softly. She would have liked that, you know. She always wanted to be remembered properly. He turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "It's strange," he murmured. "I feel as though I never really knew her. All my life I thought she despised me, but now, after everything, you tell me she meant to forgive me. It feels like I've inherited a ghost rather than an estate." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "Ghosts often accompany forgiveness, my dear. They linger until we learn what to forgive in ourselves." He looked down at the grave. "Inspector Graves says the house will go to the parish once the papers are finalized. I've agreed to it. It feels right somehow. A way of letting her rest." Miss Marple nodded. "A generous decision." Then, after a pause, she added, "And what of you? Will you go north, as you once said?" He hesitated. "Perhaps not. I've thought of staying on a while. There's something about this place that demands understanding. I can't explain it. Sometimes, when I walk through those empty rooms, I feel as though she's still there, watching, waiting for something left undone." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "The dead rarely wait for the living, Mr. Thornton. It's usually the other way around." He smiled faintly, but his eyes betrayed unease. "I keep hearing things at night, footsteps in the upper corridor. Once I thought I saw a light in her study, but the house is locked and no one's meant to be there." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Footsteps can belong to memory as much as to men, but if it troubles you, we might have a look together." The next evening they met again at Thornton House. The solicitor had given permission for Hugh to retrieve a few remaining personal items before the estate passed fully to the church. The rooms were cold and echoing, the air tinged with the faint scent of lavender and dust. Miss Marple moved slowly through the hall, her candle casting long, shifting shadows along the walls. In the drawing room, where Lady Thornton had written her final letter, the fire grate stood empty. Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the mantelpiece, where the portrait of Sir Edward Thornton had once hung. It was gone. She turned to Hugh. "Did you move this?" He shook his head. "No, it's been gone since the police search." She frowned. "Strange. The Reverend might have removed it to protect her reputation, but I doubt he'd destroy it. Perhaps he hid something behind it." They examined the wall. Beneath the faint rectangle of cleaner wallpaper, a small brass hook glinted. Miss Marple pressed it gently, and a section of the paneling shifted, revealing a shallow cavity behind. Inside lay a sealed envelope, brittle with age. Hugh's hands trembled as he drew it out. "It's addressed to me." "Then open it," she said softly. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakably Lady Thornton's, though weaker, uneven. His eyes moved across the page, widening as he read. "She says she found the truth about her husband's death," he murmured. "That it wasn't an accident, that someone pushed him from his horse. She writes, he discovered what Albert had done with the trust accounts and threatened exposure. The fall was not chance. I kept the secret to save the church, and it has damned me ever since." He stopped, his voice hollow. She knew all these years. Miss Marple felt the chill of comprehension pass through her like a winter draught. Then Redmayne's guilt ran deeper than fraud. The Reverend's silence spared him, and Lady Thornton bore that silence like a penance. Hugh sank into a chair, the paper shaking in his hand. Why would she hide this? Why not tell the truth? "Because, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. She believed redemption could only come through silence. She thought suffering was payment. It is a belief not uncommon among those raised in duty and pride. He stared at the letter for a long moment, then folded it carefully. "I'll give it to Inspector Graves. It ought to be part of the record." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, "though I dare say it will never reach the papers. The dead, you see, are often protected by the living, out of fear or pity. Both are poor guardians of the truth." As they left the house, the wind moved through the trees like a sigh, lifting the last of the autumn leaves across the path. Miss Marple paused on the steps, glancing back once more at the dim windows of Thornton House. "It is finished now," she said quietly. "The circle has closed." Hugh looked at her uncertainly. "Do you believe she's at peace?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes soft but knowing. "Peace is not a place, Mr. Thornton. It's the moment when truth and forgiveness finally meet and stop arguing." He nodded, the words lingering between them like the echo of a prayer. Together they walked into the misty dusk, the great house fading behind them, leaving only the faint scent of lavender on the cold, still air. The following Sunday dawned bright, the first true light St. Mary Mead had seen in weeks. The mist was gone, the air fresh and cold, the bells ringing with a clarity that made the village feel momentarily reborn. Miss Marple walked to the church at her usual hour, though the congregation was thinner now, and the pew where Reverend Clement had once stood remained respectfully empty. Life, she thought, has a quiet way of resuming itself, never quite the same, but persistent all the same. After the service, Inspector Graves joined her by the gate, his manner softened by the relief of closure. "It's strange," he said, glancing toward the churchyard. "When I started this case, I thought it would be another domestic tragedy. An old woman, a quarrel, a letter gone astray, but it turned out to be half the village tied in one web of secrets." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, not so strange, Inspector. Evil doesn't usually arrive in grand disguises." It comes as duty or pride or kindness misplaced. People do dreadful things when they believe they're doing them for the right reasons. Graves nodded thoughtfully. I suppose that's true. Still, you've a gift for untangling such webs. I wonder, what do you make of Lady Thornton now, knowing all that's been uncovered? Miss Marple's gaze drifted across the graveyard, the frost glinting on the stones like thin lace. She was a proud woman, wounded more by betrayal than by loss, but in her own way, she sought redemption. Her letters, her will, even her silence, all were attempts to make sense of what she could not forgive in herself. She wanted truth to surface, but only after she was beyond its reach. There's a peculiar vanity in that. Graves smiled ruefully. You make it sound almost merciful. Mercy, she said quietly, was the one virtue that eluded them all. The vicar thought he was showing mercy by concealing sin, Redmayne by protecting reputation, and Lady Thornton by forgiving too late. Each mistook silence for grace. But true mercy, she added, looking up at him, is simply truth spoken kindly. They walked slowly down the lane toward the village green, where the frost was beginning to melt. The ordinary rhythm of life had returned. Children ran between the hedges, Mrs. Bantry waved from her garden gate, and the sound of a kettle whistling carried faintly through the air. Yet beneath the comfort of routine, Miss Marple sensed the fragile stillness of a place that had glimpsed too much of its own reflection. Later that afternoon, she sat by her fire, her knitting idle on her lap. On the table beside her lay one final letter, Hugh Thornton's. It had arrived that morning, written in a firm, steady hand. He thanked her for her kindness, told her he had decided not to sell the estate after all, but to reopen it as a rest home for clergy and scholars, a place of quiet study and reflection, as his aunt might have wished. He had enclosed, too, the last of Lady Thornton's personal papers, now returned to her rightful place in the parish archives. Miss Marple smiled as she folded the letter away. It was a fitting conclusion, she thought, though conclusions rarely lasted. The house that had begun in secrecy would end in peace. And in that, perhaps, Lady Thornton had finally achieved the forgiveness she had so long deferred. As dusk settled, she rose and lit her lamp. The golden glow filled the room, soft and steady. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour, calm now, no longer ominous, and the faint scent of lavender drifted through the air from the sachet that always hung near her window. For a moment, she imagined she could almost see Lady Thornton there, seated at her writing desk, pen poised, her face serene at last. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back over the entire affair. The letter at the vicarage, the vanished gardener, the frightened maid, the web of half-truths woven over a lifetime. Every story, she reflected, begins with a simple act of concealment. Someone hides what they cannot bear to face, and in time, that secret takes on a life of its own. The detective's task is merely to listen, to notice when the silence grows louder than the words. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat once more by the fire. The flames flickered and settled, their glow reflected faintly in her spectacles. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called. All was still again. As she reached for her knitting, she smiled, a small, private smile known only to those who have seen how frailty and deceit can coexist within even the gentlest of souls. Humanity, she thought, was endlessly complicated, but endlessly worth saving. And though the truth could wound, it could also heal if one only dared to speak it before it was too late. Outside, the wind moved softly through the hedgerows, carrying with it the faint toll of the church bell. Slow, measured, and at last, peaceful. Miss Marple set aside her cup, drew her shawl a little closer, and let the fire warm her hands. The village of St. Mary Mead slept quietly under the fading sky, and for the first time in many nights, she too allowed herself to rest. The end.